I've always prided myself on being a hard-working man. My name is Daniel. I've lived in Chicago all my life, making a decent living and building what I thought was a solid marriage with my wife, Sophie. Our life together seemed to follow a perfect script, until that one fateful evening when everything started to unravel. It was a typical Thursday evening, and I was winding down after a long day at work. I had just settled into my favorite chair with a glass of bourbon, letting the warmth of the drink seep into my bones, when I heard a knock at the door. It was an unexpected sound. We rarely had visitors without notice. I put down my glass and walked over to the door, curious to see who it was. To my surprise, it was our young neighbor, Sam. He was a recent addition to our quiet neighborhood, a college kid who had moved in about 6 months ago. He was polite but kept mostly to himself, so his presence on my porch was unusual, to say the least. "Hey, Daniel," he greeted me, his voice sounding a bit uncertain. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" I nodded and gestured for him to come in, but he shook his head. "No, I think it's better if we talk out here." That struck me as odd, but I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. The evening air was crisp, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk. Sam shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking uncomfortable. "What's on your mind, Sam?" I asked, trying to keep my tone friendly. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. "I don't know how to tell you this, Daniel. It's really none of my business, but I thought you should know." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "Know what?" "Last night I was at the Rusty Nail, the bar down the street, and I saw Sophie there." I blinked in surprise. Sophie? At a bar? It didn't make any sense. Sophie had always been more of a homebody, preferring quiet nights with a book or a movie over noisy bars. "You must be mistaken," I said, shaking my head. "Sophie doesn't go to bars." "I thought the same thing," Sam continued, his expression earnest. "But it was definitely her. She was talking to some guy I didn't recognize. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but they left together." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the air rush out of my lungs and my vision blurred for a moment. "Are you sure?" I managed to ask, my voice barely more than a whisper. Sam nodded, looking genuinely pained to be the bearer of such news. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I know this is hard to hear. I just thought you should know." I stood there, stunned and silent, trying to process what Sam had just told me. Sophie, my Sophie, cheating on me? The thought was almost too much to bear. I thanked Sam for telling me and watched as he walked back to his apartment, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I went back inside, my mind racing. I poured myself another glass of bourbon, but the warmth I had felt earlier was replaced by a cold, gnawing fear. Could it be true? Had Sophie really betrayed me? I needed to know the truth no matter how much it hurt. When Sophie came home later that evening, I could barely look at her. She greeted me with her usual warm smile, but I couldn't bring myself to return it. The words of Sam's revelation were echoing in my mind, each syllable a dagger in my heart. "Hey, honey, everything okay?" she asked, noticing my distant demeanor. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the confrontation. "Sophie, can we talk?" Her smile faltered and she looked at me with a mixture of concern and confusion. "Of course, what's going on?" I led her to the living room where we sat down on the couch. I could see the worry in her eyes as she watched me, waiting for me to speak. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I forced myself to push through it. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "Were you at the Rusty Nail last night?" Sophie's eyes widened in surprise, and she hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, I was. Why do you ask?" "And did you leave with someone?" I pressed, my heart pounding in my chest. She looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I did." I felt my world come crashing down around me. The woman I had loved and trusted for so long had betrayed me. "Who was he?" I demanded, my voice rising with anger and hurt. "It was just some guy," Sophie said, her voice barely audible. "I was drunk, and it was a mistake. I'm so sorry, Daniel." Her words felt like a slap in the face. A mistake? How could she be so casual about something that was tearing me apart inside? I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. "How could you do this to me, Sophie?" I shouted, the pain and betrayal evident in my voice. "How could you throw away everything we have for a one-night stand?" Tears filled her eyes and she reached out to me, but I pulled away. "I don't know," she cried. "I was drunk and stupid and I made a terrible mistake. Please, Daniel, you have to believe me. I love you." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this was just a one-time lapse in judgment and that we could move past it. But the hurt was too fresh, too raw. I needed time to think, to process everything. "I can't do this right now," I said, my voice breaking. "I need some time." Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my coat and left the house. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get away, to clear my head. As I walked through the dark streets of Chicago, the reality of Sophie's betrayal settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I ended up at a small park a few blocks away, sitting on a bench and staring at the ground. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, hurt, confusion. How could this have happened? How could Sophie have done this to me? I stayed there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of everything. Eventually, I knew I had to go back home. I couldn't avoid Sophie forever, and we needed to talk about what had happened and what it meant for our future. When I walked back into the house, Sophie was sitting on the couch, her face streaked with tears. She looked up as I entered, her eyes pleading for forgiveness. "Daniel, please," she begged. "I know I messed up, but I love you. Can we please try to work this out?" I stood there looking at the woman I had loved for so long, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we could get past this. Maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild what had been broken. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you," I said honestly, "but I love you too, and I want to try." Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Daniel. I promise. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." As we sat down to talk, I knew it wouldn't be easy. Trust had been shattered, and it would take time to rebuild. But for the first time that night, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this together. The days that followed our confrontation were some of the hardest I had ever experienced. The raw wound of Sophie's betrayal lingered, casting a shadow over everything we did. We tried to go about our daily routines, but there was an unspoken tension between us that was impossible to ignore. Every time I looked at her, I couldn't help but remember what she had done, and the doubt gnawed at me constantly. About a month after our painful conversation, something unexpected happened. Sophie started feeling unwell, nausea, fatigue, and an unusual sensitivity to smells. At first we chalked it up to stress, given everything that had happened, but when her symptoms persisted, she decided to take a pregnancy test. I could see the mix of hope and fear in her eyes as she waited for the results. When the test came back positive, Sophie was both shocked and elated. Despite our strained relationship, she couldn't help but be excited about the prospect of a child. She came to me, her eyes wide with a mixture of emotions. "Daniel, I'm pregnant," she said, her voice trembling. "We're going to have a baby." The news hit me like a freight train. A part of me wanted to be happy, to share in her excitement, but there was an underlying fear that I couldn't shake. The timing of the pregnancy was too close to the night of her betrayal, and the nagging doubt about the baby's paternity loomed over me like a dark cloud. That's amazing news," I said, forcing a smile. "But Sophie, we need to talk about something important." She nodded, her expression turning serious. "I know, Daniel. I've been thinking about it too. We need to find out if this baby is really yours." The thought of a paternity test made my stomach churn, but I knew it was necessary. I couldn't go through the entire pregnancy with this doubt hanging over us. Sophie and I sat down together and discussed our options. We agreed to schedule an appointment with her doctor to discuss prenatal paternity testing, even though the idea of it filled us both with dread. In the meantime, we tried to navigate the emotional minefield of our situation. Sophie was determined to make things right between us, but I could see the guilt and uncertainty weighing on her. I wanted to be supportive, to be the partner she needed, but the fear that the baby might not be mine was always at the forefront of my mind. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Sophie reached out and took my hand. Her touch was gentle, but I could feel the desperation in her grip. "Daniel, I know this is hard," she said softly, "but I need you to know that I'm committed to making this work. I want us to be a family, and I truly hope that this baby is yours." I looked into her eyes and saw the sincerity there. Despite everything, I still loved her, and I wanted to believe that we could find a way through this. "I want that too, Sophie," I replied, "but we have to be prepared for whatever the test results might show." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand. I just hope that we can find a way to move forward no matter what." The following week, we went to the doctor together. The atmosphere in the waiting room was tense, both of us anxious about what was to come. The doctor explained the process of prenatal paternity testing, outlining the risks and the accuracy of the results. We agreed to proceed, knowing that we needed the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As we left the doctor's office, the weight of our decision settled over us. The next few weeks would be a test of our strength and our commitment to each other. We tried to keep busy, focusing on work and preparing for the baby as best we could, but the uncertainty was always there, a constant reminder of the fragility of our situation. One evening, as we were preparing dinner, Sophie turned to me with a look of determination. "Daniel, there's something else I need to tell you." I set down the knife I was using to chop vegetables and looked at her, bracing myself for whatever she had to say. "What is it, Sophie?" She took a deep breath, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "I want you to know that no matter what the test results show, I believe this baby will be a blessing for us. I've been thinking a lot about our marriage, and I realize that we need this chance to start over, to rebuild what we've lost." Her words took me by surprise. I had been so focused on the potential outcome of the test that I hadn't allowed myself to think about what it could mean for our future. "You really believe that?" I asked, my voice tinged with skepticism. "Yes," she replied firmly. "I know I've made mistakes, but I want to make things right. I want us to be a family, Daniel. I want this baby to be a symbol of our second chance." I could see the sincerity in her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe she was right. Maybe this baby could be the catalyst for healing and renewal that we so desperately needed. We spent the next few days trying to focus on the positive, allowing ourselves to dream about the future we wanted to create. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of doubt and fear, but we were determined to hold on to the hope that this baby could bring us closer together. Finally, the day of the paternity test results arrived. We went to the doctor's office, our hearts pounding with anticipation. As we sat in the waiting room holding hands, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. This moment would determine the course of our lives, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for the truth. When the doctor called us into her office, Sophie squeezed my hand tightly. We sat down and the doctor began to speak, her expression serious. "Daniel, Sophie, I have the results of the paternity test," she said. "I know this has been a difficult time for both of you, and I want you to know that whatever the outcome, it's important to focus on the love and commitment you have for each other." I held my breath as she opened the envelope and looked at the results. The room seemed to close in around us, the air heavy with anticipation. "The test shows that there is a 99.9% probability that Daniel is the biological father of the baby," the doctor announced. The relief that washed over me was indescribable. I felt the weight of the world lift from my shoulders, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to smile. Sophie let out a sob of relief, tears streaming down her face as she turned to me. "Daniel, we did it," she whispered. "We're going to be parents." I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly as the reality of our future began to sink in. We had been given a second chance, and I was determined to make the most of it. We would face challenges, no doubt, but together we could overcome anything. As we left the doctor's office hand in hand, I felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. This baby was a blessing, a symbol of our resilience and our commitment to each other. And as we prepared for the journey of parenthood, I knew that we were stronger together, ready to face whatever the future held. The months of Sophie's pregnancy were a roller coaster of emotions. After receiving the paternity test results, we had both thrown ourselves into preparing for the arrival of our child. We attended parenting classes, decorated the nursery, and spent countless hours talking about the future. Despite the doubts that had plagued me earlier, I had begun to feel a genuine excitement about becoming a father. However, beneath my hopeful exterior, a small nagging doubt lingered. The stakes were high, and I couldn't help but worry that something might go wrong. As Sophie's due date approached, my anxiety grew, but I kept it to myself, not wanting to burden her with my fears. The day Sophie went into labor, I was a bundle of nerves. We rushed to the hospital, and I held her hand through every contraction, offering words of encouragement and support. Seeing her in pain was difficult, but knowing that we would soon meet our daughter filled me with a mix of anticipation and fear. After hours of labor, Sophie finally gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. As the nurse placed our daughter in Sophie's arms, I felt a surge of love and protectiveness. Tears filled my eyes as I looked at the tiny, fragile life we had created. But as I gazed at her face, my heart sank. Our daughter, Kim, had dark skin, a stark contrast to both Sophie's and my own fair complexions. In that moment, the truth I had been dreading hit me with full force. Despite the earlier test results, it was painfully clear that I was not Kim's biological father. The room seemed to spin, and I had to steady myself against the wall. Sophie looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. She must have seen the devastation on my face, for she quickly handed Kim to the nurse and reached for my hand. "Daniel, I don't understand," she stammered, her voice trembling. I pulled away from her touch, feeling a chasm open up between us. "How could this happen, Sophie? The test said I was the father. How could this be?" Tears streamed down her cheeks as she shook her head. "I don't know, Daniel. I swear. I don't know." Anger and pain surged through me. I felt betrayed all over again, the wound from her infidelity torn open anew. The dream I had nurtured of being a father was shattered, replaced by a cold, harsh reality. I stumbled out of the delivery room, needing to get away, to find some space to breathe. The hallways of the hospital blurred as I walked aimlessly, trying to process what had just happened. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, hurt, confusion. I had wanted so badly to believe that we could move past Sophie's betrayal, that this baby would be a fresh start for us. But now all those hopes felt like a cruel joke. I found myself in the hospital chapel, a small, dimly lit room where people came to seek solace. I sank onto one of the benches, burying my face in my hands. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. How could I accept this child, knowing she was a constant reminder of Sophie's betrayal? How could I pretend to be a father to a baby who wasn't mine? The questions swirled in my mind, and I felt utterly lost. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps behind me. I looked up to see Sophie standing in the doorway, her face pale and tear-streaked. She hesitated for a moment before walking over to sit beside me. "Daniel, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We need to talk about this." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my emotions. "What is there to talk about, Sophie? It's obvious what happened. Kim isn't mine." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away, the pain too fresh. "I don't know how this happened," she said, her voice pleading. "But I love you, Daniel. I love you, and I want us to be a family." "How can we be a family when our entire relationship is built on lies?" I shot back, my voice raw with emotion. "You lied to me, Sophie. You made me believe this baby was mine, and now I don't know what to believe." Sophie's tears flowed freely as she looked at me, her eyes filled with desperation. "I never meant to hurt you, Daniel. I hoped. You hoped this baby would save our marriage," I finished for her. "But all it's done is show me how deep the betrayal goes." We sat in silence, the weight of our shattered dreams hanging heavily between us. I didn't know how to move forward from this. I didn't know if I could ever forgive Sophie, or if I could ever accept Kim as my own. Eventually I stood up, needing to get away from the suffocating pain. "I need some time," I said quietly. "I need to figure out what to do next." Sophie nodded, her face a mask of sorrow. "I understand," she whispered. "But please, Daniel, don't give up on us. Don't give up on Kim." I didn't respond. I walked out of the chapel, feeling more lost and broken than I ever had before. The future that had seemed so bright and full of promise just a few hours ago now felt like a dark, uncertain abyss. Over the next few days, I tried to come to terms with the reality of our situation. I spent long hours walking the streets of Chicago, my mind in turmoil. I knew that Sophie and Kim needed me, but I didn't know if I had the strength to be there for them. Every time I thought about holding Kim, about looking into her eyes, I felt a surge of pain and resentment. How could I love a child who was a living reminder of my wife's betrayal? How could I be a father to a baby who wasn't mine? Despite my turmoil, I knew that I couldn't avoid Sophie and Kim forever. I needed to face the reality of our situation and make a decision about our future. With a heavy heart, I returned to the hospital to see them. When I walked into Sophie's room, she was sitting up in bed, cradling Kim in her arms. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Daniel," she said softly, "I'm glad you're here." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my emotions. "We need to talk, Sophie," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to figure out what happens next." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I know, and whatever you decide, I'll understand. But please, Daniel, give us a chance. Give Kim a chance." I looked at Kim, sleeping peacefully in Sophie's arms. She was innocent in all of this, a tiny life caught in the middle of our shattered dreams. Despite my anger and pain, I felt a flicker of something, love maybe, or at least a sense of responsibility. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," I said quietly, "but I'm willing to try. For Kim's sake." Sophie's face lit up with hope, and she reached out to take my hand. "Thank you, Daniel. That's all I can ask for." As I held Kim for the first time, I felt a surge of conflicting emotions. She was so small, so vulnerable, and despite everything, I couldn't help but feel a connection to her. Maybe with time, I could learn to love her as my own. Maybe with time, Sophie and I could heal the wounds of the past and find a way to move forward together. But for now, all I could do was take it one day at a time, holding on to the fragile hope that we could rebuild our broken family. Bringing Sophie and Kim home from the hospital was a bittersweet experience. On one hand, I was glad to have them both back under our roof. On the other, the reality of our situation weighed heavily on me, making it hard to find joy in what should have been a happy occasion. We settled into a routine quickly. Sophie and I shared the responsibilities of caring for Kim, taking turns feeding her, changing her diapers, and soothing her cries. Sophie seemed to thrive in her new role as a mother, and I could see the love she had for Kim in every tender gesture, every soft word. As for me, I tried my best to be there for both of them, to play the part of a devoted husband and father, but it was far from easy. Every time I looked at Kim, I was reminded of Sophie's betrayal. Her dark skin was a constant, painful reminder that she wasn't mine, that my wife had been unfaithful. I couldn't shake the image of Sophie with another man, the betrayal gnawing at me day and night. Despite my best efforts, the resentment and anger festered inside me, poisoning any chance I had of bonding with Kim. One sleepless night, as I rocked Kim in my arms, trying to calm her cries, the weight of my emotions became too much to bear. I looked down at her innocent face, and a surge of anger and sorrow welled up inside me. How could Sophie have done this to us? How could she have thrown away everything we had for a moment of weakness? And who was the man who had fathered this child? I found myself obsessing over the question of Kim's paternity. I couldn't stop wondering who the real father was, if he knew about Kim, and if he ever thought about her. The uncertainty gnawed at me, making it impossible to find any peace. I tried to push these thoughts aside, to focus on being there for Sophie and Kim, but the doubts and suspicions were always there, lurking in the back of my mind. One afternoon, as Sophie and I sat together in the living room, watching Kim sleep in her crib, I couldn't hold back any longer. "Sophie, we need to talk," I said, my voice tense. She looked at me, her eyes wide with concern. "What is it, Daniel?" "I can't stop thinking about it," I admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I can't stop wondering who the real father is. It's driving me crazy." Sophie's face crumpled with pain, and she reached out to take my hand. "Daniel, I understand. I know this is hard. But does it really matter who the father is? Kim is our daughter. We're a family." I pulled my hand away, unable to hide the anger and hurt in my voice. "It matters to me, Sophie. Every time I look at her, I'm reminded of what you did. I'm reminded that she's not mine." Tears filled her eyes and she looked away, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I wish I could change what happened, but I can't. All I can do is ask for your forgiveness and hope that we can find a way to move forward." I wanted to forgive her, to move past the betrayal and build a new life together. But every time I tried, the anger and resentment would resurface, making it impossible to let go. I felt trapped in a cycle of pain and doubt, unable to find a way out. As the weeks passed, I found myself withdrawing more and more. I went through the motions of caring for Kim, but my heart wasn't in it. I felt like an outsider in my own home, a stranger to the family I was supposed to be a part of. The more I tried to force myself to bond with Kim, the more I realized that I couldn't do it. I couldn't raise and love a child who wasn't mine, a child who was a constant reminder of my wife's betrayal. One evening, as I watched Sophie and Kim together, a painful realization settled over me. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I couldn't keep living this lie, trying to be a father to a child who wasn't mine. It wasn't fair to Sophie, to Kim, or to myself. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the conversation I knew we needed to have. "Sophie, we need to talk," I said quietly. She looked up at me, her expression wary. "What is it, Daniel?" "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice breaking. "I can't keep pretending that everything is okay. I can't raise Kim. I've tried, but every time I look at her, I'm reminded of what you did. It's tearing me apart." Tears filled her eyes and she shook her head, her voice pleading. "Daniel, please, don't say that. We can work through this. We can find a way to make it work." I shook my head, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "I wish I could, Sophie, but I can't. I can't be a father to a child who isn't mine. It's not fair to Kim, and it's not fair to us." She looked at me, her eyes filled with despair. "What are you saying, Daniel? Are you leaving us?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice choked with emotion. "But I know I can't keep living like this. I need to figure out what's best for all of us." The pain in her eyes was almost too much to bear, and I had to look away. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew that continuing down this path would only lead to more heartache. I needed time to think, to figure out what I truly wanted and what was best for everyone involved. As I walked out of the room, the weight of my decision settled over me. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I couldn't keep living this lie. The road ahead was uncertain, and the pain of Sophie's betrayal was still fresh, but I hoped that somehow we could all find a way to heal and move forward. For now, all I could do was take it one day at a time, trying to find a path through the darkness. And maybe, just maybe, I would find a way to forgive Sophie and build a new life, even if it meant letting go of the dream I had once held so dear. The next morning dawned with a heavy, oppressive silence. The weight of the previous night's conversation with Sophie still hung in the air, and I found it hard to shake the sense of impending doom. I went through the motions of getting ready for work, but my mind was elsewhere, tangled in the web of doubts and fears that had become my constant companions. As I finished my coffee and prepared to leave, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for another day of pretending everything was normal. But as I opened the front door, I was met with a sight that made my heart skip a beat. Standing on the porch, looking nervous and out of place, was Sam, our young neighbor. "Sam," I said, my voice tinged with confusion and suspicion. "What are you doing here?" He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and determination. "Daniel, we need to talk. There's something I need to tell you, Something important. I felt a cold dread settle over me as I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. What is it, Sam? What do you need to tell me? He took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. It's about Kim, he began, his voice trembling. I'm her father. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt my knees go weak and for a moment I couldn't speak. What did you say? I finally managed to choke out. I'm Kim's father, he repeated, his voice steadier now. I've been in love with Sophie for a long time, despite our age difference. That night at the bar, I got her drunk and asked her to sleep with me. She didn't object, and we ended up sleeping together. Anger surged through me, a red-hot wave that made my vision blur. Without thinking, I lashed out, my fist connecting with Sam's jaw. He stumbled back, falling to the ground with a grunt. For a moment I stood over him, my chest heaving with rage. Sam looked up at me, his face pale and bruised. I'm sorry, Daniel, he said, his voice filled with regret. I never meant for things to get this far. I never wanted to hurt you. I could barely hear his words over the roaring in my ears. I felt a mix of fury and despair, a potent cocktail that left me reeling. How could you? I shouted. How could you do this to me? To us? He struggled to his feet, wincing in pain. I was selfish, he admitted. I thought I was in love and I didn't think about the consequences. I'm sorry, Daniel, I truly am. I shook my head, feeling a bitter laugh bubble up in my throat. Sorry doesn't fix this, Sam. Sorry doesn't change the fact that you ruined everything. He hung his head, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I know, and I'll have to live with that. But I needed you to know the truth. You deserve that much. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing on the porch, my fists still clenched, my heart pounding in my chest. I watched him go, feeling a mix of satisfaction and sorrow. He had confessed, but his words had only deepened the wound. I went back inside, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on me. Sophie was in the living room holding Kim and looking at me with wide, worried eyes. What happened? She asked, her voice trembling. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Sam was here, I said quietly. He confessed. He's Kim's father. Her face crumpled, and she started to cry. I'm so sorry, Daniel. I never meant for any of this to happen. I felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger, sorrow, love, and betrayal. I know, Sophie, I said, my voice breaking, but knowing doesn't make it any easier. We sat down together, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. Kim slept peacefully in Sophie's arms, unaware of the turmoil around her. I looked at my wife, the woman I had loved for so long, and I felt a deep, aching sadness. Our lives had been shattered, and I didn't know if we could ever put the pieces back together. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. I want to forgive you, Sophie. I want to be a father to Kim. But every time I look at her, I'm reminded of what you did. She reached out, taking my hand in hers. I know, Daniel, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. I love you, and I want us to be a family. I looked into her eyes and saw the sincerity there, the desperate hope that we could find a way through this. And despite everything, I still loved her. But love alone wasn't enough to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. I need time, I said finally. Time to think, to figure out what's best for all of us. She nodded, her tears falling silently. Take all the time you need, Daniel. I'll be here, waiting. As I left the house, I felt a heavy sense of uncertainty. The future was a dark, unknown path, and I didn't know where it would lead. But I knew that I needed to find a way to heal, to come to terms with the betrayal and the pain. Only then could I decide what was best for myself, for Sophie, and for Kim. I walked through the streets of Chicago, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The city around me bustled with life, but I felt disconnected, adrift in a sea of confusion and heartache. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I needed to face it head on, to find a way to move forward, no matter how difficult it might be. And maybe, just maybe, I would find a way to forgive and rebuild. But for now, All I could do was take it one step at a time, hoping that the path would become clearer as I went. The months after Sam's confession were a blur. I moved out of the house, leaving Sophie and Kim behind. We decided it was best for everyone involved to put some distance between us, at least for a while. I rented a small apartment across town, trying to find some semblance of normalcy in a life that had been turned upside down. Sophie and I maintained a strained, uneasy truce. We saw each other occasionally in the park while walking Kim. Those moments were bittersweet, seeing Kim grow and change, her innocent smile a painful reminder of what could have been. I found myself developing a fondness for her despite everything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. The scars from Sophie's betrayal were too deep, too raw. As time passed, my feelings of affection for Kim became intertwined with my lingering feelings for Sophie. I wanted to move on, to find a way to heal, but every encounter with them reopened the wounds. Sophie seemed to hope that we could somehow reconcile, but I knew better. The love we had once shared was tainted, and no amount of time or effort could change that. One evening, after a particularly tense encounter in the park, I decided it was time to make a clean break. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, holding on to a future that was never meant to be. I called Sophie and asked her to meet me at a nearby cafe. It was time to have the difficult conversation I had been avoiding for so long. When she arrived, I could see the hope in her eyes. She still believed there was a chance for us, but I knew it was a false hope. I took a deep breath and began, "Sophie, we need to talk about our future." She nodded, her expression cautious. "What about it, Daniel?" "I think it's time we get a divorce," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We can't keep pretending that things will get better. We need to move on with our lives." Her face fell, and I could see the shock and hurt in her eyes. "Daniel, please. We can make this work. We've been through so much together." I shook my head. "No, Sophie. We've been through too much. There's too much pain, too much betrayal. We need to let go." Her demeanor changed suddenly, and a cold, calculating look came over her. "If you think you're just going to walk away, you're wrong. I'll take everything from you. I'll ruin your life." I was taken aback by the venom in her words. I had never seen this side of Sophie before. "You've already ruined my life," I said quietly. "What more can you take from me?" Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned closer. "I'll take the house, the car, everything, and you'll never see Kim again." I felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over me. This wasn't the woman I had married. The Sophie I had loved would never have threatened me like this. "What happened to you, Sophie? How did we get here?" She didn't answer, just stared at me with a cold, hard expression. I stood up, feeling a mixture of despair and determination. "You can have everything," I said. "The house, the car, whatever you want. But I'm done. We're done." I walked out of the cafe feeling a strange sense of relief. The decision to divorce was painful, but it was the right one. There was no future for us. Not after everything that had happened. In the weeks that followed, I filed for divorce and began the painful process of untangling our lives. Sophie fought me at every turn, making the process as difficult as possible, but I held firm, knowing that this was the only way forward. One morning, not long after the divorce was finalized, I woke up feeling unwell. At first I thought it was just the stress of everything catching up with me, but as the days passed, my condition worsened. I went to the doctor and received devastating news. I had an aggressive form of cancer. The diagnosis hit me like a freight train. Suddenly, all the pain and turmoil of the past year seemed insignificant. I was facing the end of my life, and I didn't know how much time I had left. I decided to keep the news to myself for a while, not wanting to burden anyone with my illness. Despite everything, I continued to see Kim occasionally. She was growing so fast, her bright eyes and infectious smile a reminder of the innocence and joy I had once hoped to find in fatherhood. I realized that despite everything, I did love her. Maybe it was because she was a part of Sophie, a part of the life we had shared, or maybe it was because she was a beacon of hope in a world that had become so dark. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, I received a call from Sophie. She sounded distraught, and my heart ached at the sound of her voice. "Daniel, I need to see you," she said. "Please, it's important." I agreed to meet her in the park, the place where we had shared so many painful and hopeful moments. When I arrived, she was waiting for me, holding Kim in her arms. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I heard about your illness," she said softly. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I didn't want to burden you. There's been enough pain." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Daniel, despite everything, I still love you. I want to be there for you, to help you through this." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "Sophie, it's too late for us. We can't go back." She reached out, taking my hand in hers. "I know, but maybe we can find a way to move forward, together as friends. For Kim's sake." I looked down at Kim, her innocent face a reminder of the love and hope that had once defined our lives. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of peace. Maybe we can. In the weeks that followed, Sophie and I found a new kind of relationship. We were no longer husband and wife, but we were partners in raising Kim, in finding a way to create a stable, loving environment for her. As my illness progressed, Sophie was there, offering support and care, and I found myself grateful for her presence. One evening, as I lay in bed, feeling the weight of my illness pressing down on me, I looked over at Sophie sitting by my side. "I'm sorry," I said softly, "for everything." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm the one who should be sorry, Daniel. I made so many mistakes." "We both did," I replied. "But we found a way to move forward, and that's what matters." As I closed my eyes, feeling the darkness closing in, I knew that despite all the pain and betrayal, I had found a measure of peace. Sophie and I had created a new kind of family, one built on forgiveness and love. And as I drifted off, I felt a sense of gratitude for the life I had lived, for the love I had known, and for the future that Kim would have, surrounded by the love of her parents.